Comic books, a medium full of exciting adventures, larger than life heroes, and mind bending stories. I grew up on comics from the 80s and 90s that were 36 pages, and if you take away the ads, the story was usually 22 pages. Sometimes there was an arc that carried over to subsequent issues. When Action Comics number 1000 came out, I thought, how cool would it be to read all of the Action Comics issues starting from number 1? Wouldn't it be interesting to read Superman's character evolution from the beginning? That one thought took me down a rabbit hole because my next thought was I should probably read about all the other superheroes along the way to see them all evolve at the same time. And the project was born. I decided on a framework and some rules for the project. I would read about superheroes and supporting characters from DC and Marvel, as well as characters that would end up in those universes, such as the Marvel family and Blue Beetle. For the most part, I wanted to read about characters that were still active in the modern age, as the premise for the project was their evolution over the decades. But I've made some exceptions for interesting characters. I created some videos for this project already a few years ago. Those videos were about the comic books I read from week to week. But there were so many filler issues, there wasn't something interesting to report every week. This new series of videos will be about the gold nuggets about comic history and culture at the time. So imagine my surprise when I started reading Action Comics number 1 to find out it's 68 pages. I never realized Golden Age comics were so thick. You always see the covers, but you hardly ever see the side view for these comics. In the Golden Age, the stories were shorter. The storytellers only had 4 to 12 pages to share their world. The Superman story in Action Comics number 1 is only 12 pages. And then the rest of the book includes a Chuck Dawson story. He's a cowboy. You also have the first appearance story of Zatara the magician. I did read a lot about magicians, enjoyed those. A 2-page text story. I'll make a separate video on this subject. A Sticky Mitt Stimson story. That's a fun mouthful. It's a humor type of story. The Adventures of Marco Polo. Kind of a hybrid between text and illustrated story. Then you have Pep Morgan, who was an athlete and gets into all sorts of fun adventures. You have Scoop Scanlon, who was a reporter. And then the last story was Tex Thompson, who's also another cowboy. And a few ads and cartoons that makes up for the full 68 pages. And you get all that for 10 cents. Well, 10 cents at the time. I should note that I only read the Superman and Zatara stories as they fit the criteria for my project. Every comic book that I read from that era was an anthology. They all had multiple stories, often featuring different characters. But some characters would also have multiple stories in the same issues. Comic books at the time cost 10 cents, and then right up until 1962. Comic books were 10 cents going back to 1933. So that's almost 30 years without a price increase. How is that possible? I mean, that's incomprehensible by today's standards for sure. So the secret is the page count would be decreased. When I started reading the comics from 1938, there were 68 pages. And gradually over the years, they would have less pages until they got down to 36 pages. At which point, the only available option was to increase the price to 12 cents beginning in 1962. From 68 pages to 36 pages. It was the best way to keep the price from increasing and managing costs. We now know this economics term as shrinkflation. Here's some other notable 68-page issue from the early superhero days. There's Detective Comics 27, right? The Batman story in that was only 6 pages. You have Marvel Comics 1, right? Pretty big first Marvel issue. Flash Comics 1, right? First appearance of Flash. All-American Comics 16, first appearance of Green Lantern. Then in 1944, DC stuffed a comic book with 128 pages for 25 cents. The big All-American comic book. This massive book with all original content includes 15 stories plus cartoons. I mean, I read most of the stories. A lot of the characters are main characters in the DC universe at the time. And as I read my way through the 40s and 50s, there were less and less stories in each issue as there were less pages. Only makes sense. When Marvel rebooted the universe in 1962, there were only a few issues that included more than one story. They were mostly book-length stories. By this time, DC had also moved to having a lot of book-length stories. The 60s were a turning point where it was time to tell longer stories spanning full issues, even crossing over into subsequent issues or other titles. But I digress. Superheroes didn't evolve much in the 40s and 50s. They had set characteristics which didn't change, with few exceptions. The majority of bad guys were forgettable gangsters, petty criminals, dictators, and spies. There were some wild story ideas, but for the most part, they followed a pretty standard formula. It is rare to see any story break out of the 8 to 12 page standard format. There was only one story arc that bucked this trend. Fawcett ran a serial in one of their titles for 25 issues. Now, this was in Captain Marvel Adventures. It had a story featuring the evil Mr. Mind, which ran from issues number 22 to 46. And this was from 1943 to 1945. Now, the serial itself was only one of 5 stories in each issue, and each chapter was 12 pages long. So growing up in the 80s and 90s, it was a bit of a shock to learn that all of the Golden Age comics were anthologies. I had no idea. Reading those older issues had been a great learning experience about a hobby that I've loved for so long, but never knew the full history. I plan on sharing more of the history of comic books and characters that I've learned from the project. Let me know if there are some interesting topics I should be working on for a video. And of course, please like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel.